Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Review. Today we're going to be going for episode 5. Can't believe we're already here, but today we have an interesting subject because I think this is extremely relevant for the current times, and it also goes back on what's been going on for the last few years. So in the last video, of course, is very essential to understanding this, but I'll try to still speak in a way that makes you available. Anyways, so we're going to go through the topic about rebuilding the right. And the main theme we're going to be discussing is removing religion. So by the right wing, I mean the conservative forces, at least in America, that are more fundamental or traditional based. So the fundamentals can be anything, it doesn't have to be a single religion, but obviously you'll find that it is Christianity based in America. So I'm going to walk you through the current situation we're in, and then we're going to go through pendulum theory, which has to do with political movements and how they trend, principle versus victory, which is the main antithesis to what I'm trying to say, and then a bit about the next steps you must take as a member of the right. So this is going to be more of a comparative analysis to how history has treated the right and how we're going to need to move forward so that we can progress. So the current status quo is that the last 2 decades, at the very least, if not, further back, have been in the control, or the institutions have been in control of more liberal or left-wing organizations, and you've seen this with the liberalization of many different forms of not only media, but education, democracy, all of these things that create more access to people, and also social liberalization. What does this mean? Greater tolerance, greater acceptance, or even greater reverence for alternative lifestyles or more marginalized peoples. And this has been a trend that's been undeniable, at least for the last 15 years, ever since 2010, but it's more so been a trend over the last 20, 25 years, ever since the 1980s and 1990s, when the AIDS epidemic truly brought out the issue of homosexuality, which first brought on the whole cascade of issues with socialization of these marginalized groups. So notably, what I want to exclude here is the economics of each system. So more and more recently, we've gone away from that traditional thinking of economics. So traditionally, Republicans would become more fiscally conservative, and their government, in their mind, wouldn't have as big of an impact on, our economy. The government wouldn't be creating hundreds of programs that spend millions of dollars on the economy and social welfare. Rather, you'd prefer them to be more limited, and state governments or local governments would take care of all of that. On the other hand, liberal governments, at least after the early 20th century, with especially FDR and the New Deal in the 1940s, and even going back to Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, yeah, liberal classical liberal might disagree, but current liberalism is more about how the government can help you and how the government is sort of an antidote to many of the social issues we have. So you can see this through social security, and mostly I think people have come to realize that government intervention has been sort of positive, and that's kind of the point I'm making. There is no difference between these two parties when it comes to economics. While of course you might have certain differences, and absolutely Trumpian economy has been wildly different, maybe not to success thus far, but ultimately both sides fall under the neoliberal umbrella of people who support big government and people who believe that the big government must do things to help the people out. So that's the main fundamental similarity, which allows us to nitpick more at the social theory kind of thing, which is how the right or the left is going to win over the next few centuries or decades. So, given this trend over the last 25 years, at least, if we want to continue start talking about the status quo, you're going to find out that social conservatism has taken a downfall, and it's been less acceptable, especially due to cancel culture and political correctness, to bring up conservative talking points, especially in polite society where you might have someone of a disenfranchised group as your adversary or your partner. Sorry, this just froze. That's really strange. Um, yeah, if I'm not sure if that's saved, but yeah, socially it's been less polite or less acceptable to voice conservative opinions, which might seem what the left calls phobias or insensitive to people of marginalized groups. So in this process comes the idea of pendulum theory. So what is pendulum theory? What's a pendulum? To have a visual example, a pendulum would be, for example, take this nail. Pendulum would be, I guess this would be more accurate, the force on the bottom. And when you swing it from side to side, right, in a real pendulum, of course, it'll be slower, but goes up, comes back down, and continues to go up, right, if my hand was better. And here we have a diagram that models how this works. What I think is really funny about this, which is meant to be a physics thing, it says the words left and right. And so what happens is that zero position is almost never reached, only briefly, but only in passing. So, laws of gravity and common sense dictate that when something comes back down, it's not just going to stop at the middle point, it's just going to keep going, and it needs extra force to go past that middle point. It'll never just stop at zero position without there being an outside force to inhibit the movement. And so this is what pendulum theory is when it comes to politics. Always, there's been very few periods of equilibrium throughout human history where both political sides agree on something, and there isn't really a large difference between the two political camps. So what ends up happening is one side always has certain periods of victory when they have control, when they have influence over the institutions of society. And so currently, as I've just briefly, not empirically, but briefly underlined or outlined in the summary and status quo, is that currently we have a leftwards displacement. Things are not artificially, but they just happen to be the left because we were in that part of society. And why were we in this part of history or in this historical trend? Why? Because of the horrors of the 20th century. You have Stalinism, Hitler, you have Nazism. You have all these terrible things that were generally rightist, or not rightist, but I guess less socially free societies. And this caused an overreaction where, because we saw Nazism as so bad, I guess especially, we took the contrarian point where instead of being more selective about what we prioritize, everything is more about freedom, more about liberalization, that equality just became so much more of a theme of the 20th century, because it already was happening, but even more so because of the shock that the World War II era was. And because of this, we currently find ourselves in a natural leftward displacement due to a previous rightwards displacement, at least in Western society. Of course, people saw communism as a bigger threat in the East, which allowed for more capitalist reaction, which might be a video idea in the future. But ultimately, the fact is that we have a current leftward displacement, and like a pendulum, like gravity, what goes up must come down. And that's the principle we're working off of for this. So the greater the tilt to one side, the greater the fall back will be. So let's say I throw a ball up, or just walnut perhaps, just a little bit, it just comes down a little bit. But if I throw it all the way up, it's going to come down even harder and hit my hand with greater force because I put it up with greater force. And that's ultimately what ends up happening with politics. The further you push to one side, the greater the eventual pushback will be. And this is currently happening all over the world. We're beginning to see this downwards trend in leftward displacement, and we're starting to move back into rightward displacement. So if you've been keeping up at all with European politics, or even America, obviously with this latest election, you're going to see that Italy has a new very right-wing female leader. You have Hungary, Viktor Orban's been in power for many years. You have Britain, which is trying its best. You have Germany, which is already on its rightward tilt, and scary enough, their military budget's been increasing exponentially. But besides the point that, especially due to many reasons, internal and external, many of these countries and many of these leaders in the Western world are turning back towards right-wing government. And eventually this will probably turn back after the right goes too far. But currently we're in this cycle where we're going from the left and coming back to the zero, and we're not quite there yet. We're still in the leftward displacement, but we have a rightward trend in the current moment. So the main word I want to use here is overcorrection. What is an overcorrection? It means that in the process of correcting something, you go too far and you end up doing the opposite. So one might claim that the overcorrection in the 1940s was, past the 1940s, was an overcorrection of Nazism. Nazism was famous for its propaganda, its restrictiveness, its brainwashing, its racism, all these things, and we try to look to the opposite because of how horrifying what they did was. And what this represents is that this is something that we like to do. That in terms of if one thing traumatizes us so much, we're going to continue and continue and continue to try to fight against it by just doing the opposite. The problem is that this rarely works and always has long-term effects. One example might be, we can get to that to another video, but I was gonna say one example might be, with like social feminine, like free sex, but whatever. That's not the point. In 1960s, that's actually a whole video in and of itself. But the whole point is that the current trend is towards rightward distribution or displacement because it's been so far to the left for so long. And the main point, going back to the first issue, which is of course rebuilding the right, we need to find a way where we can all agree as a society how the right needs to rebuild themselves and actually regain control of society in a way that is in line with the current trend they're following, but also is conducive to society at large. On the other hand, if I was a right-wing leader, for example, you would want a way for you to attract more people into your cause while you have this momentum. You want more people becoming right-wingers, conservative, whatever word you want to use. You have that duty as a leader, and that's what you want to do. So here's some thoughts about how I think the right will take advantage of the current historical situation. So before we get into principle versus victory, I want to first mention that pendulum theory has been something that people have mentioned before, and it's not completely novel, but I have extra evidence based on my previous videos that back it up, because history has always been about a push and pull. Not exactly a mirroring, but a push and pull between sides, between big government, small government, liberalization, and authoritarianism. You have religious, atheism, all of these conflicting forces that push and pull. And ultimately, what you get is a pendulum-like motion. Economically, this is true as well. We have this graph we've used in the last video about where we are right now in different ages of history. And if you look here, you're gonna see different a lot of these eras can be characterized by certain ideologies that were rampant around the world. For example, American Civil War, at least domestically, was between two different nations, warring between government control over private estates, which ultimately is what slavery came down to, the economic problem. The ethical thing was something aside. Post-war prosperity, what was that? That was our success after World War II, and that was largely successful. However, the burst of energy we got from that is wearing off, and this whole, if you see the two red lines which say ages of discord, it shows how good things lead to bad things, or one thing leads to another thing. But there's no, as we discussed before in our first video, just because there's an era of good feelings doesn't mean that's good. It's just a part of the process. An era of good feelings leads to an age of discord, which is bad, and people die. But then that leads to another greater age of prosperity. And that's the whole point. In the first video, you can check it out, which is that everything is good because everything serves a purpose. Every bad event allows for greater good events to happen in the future. And that's the essence of what we're talking about. And thus, we want to get into principle versus victory. So, what matters more? Dignity or victory? And for politicians especially, that's a big trade-off, because you might have these certain moral obligations to a cause, to yourself, to your religion, to your family. At the same time, you don't want to lose your position. You have a job, you have people to govern, you have a family to feed, and moreover, you have this sort of, you want to keep your job as well, right? You want to continue being a politician. If you want that power, if you want whatever it might be, you still want to keep your victory. You want to keep winning, keeping person in power. So where's this trade-off? Obviously, you don't want to lose your heart. Like, you were voted based on the values you bring, which is partly derived from, of course, your dignity. What do you represent? And to trade that off for victory can be difficult for many, especially those who are religious. And to rally those people under you who are also religious, who believe in your policy because you have the same origins as them, that's a difficult thing to do. You can't abandon those people. But there's multiple ways people go into this. So I'm going to start by telling a story about the right. So we talked about in the last video about humans need structure. They need ideology to function. So fundamentally, the religious right, at least, is driven by religious fundamentalism. Or it doesn't have to be religious, but a certain, adherence to strict moral codes and a resistance to change, as is characterized by the word conservatism, or traditionalist, or fundamentalist. And this is, while valuable, and of course I respect it as, a principle sort of issue, victory wise, it hasn't been the best at organizing and deploying advocates, at least in urban society. Obviously, if you look at the maps, you'll find that more rural counties are almost always more Republican, more religious, more, these tight communities that are not urban happen to be more religious, and these are the main demographics. But in this focus on religion, on this talk and this focus on bringing God back into America, which is absolutely very important, they're missing the point, which is that they need to still win. And they already won, right? They won, the Republicans won in 2024, not due to their social obligations, but due to the promises they brought to the American people, which are more material, which we'll get into in section 5, next steps. So the more general question I try to pose here in this section, principle versus victory, is to what point does a ideology need to sacrifice its original principle to achieve victory? So a great parallel for this might be the Russian Revolution, for example. The initial writings of Karl Marx were, idealistic. They promised something greater that maybe wouldn't work now that we know. But at the time, it was something promising that people really believed in, and one such man was Vladimir Lenin. And he had this, principle of freeing the working classes, right, the working masses. But in the process, he, I don't know about accidentally, but he installed himself as dictator to achieve the victory he needed. Otherwise, you can't organize a mass against the multi-century long czarist government without having some sort of leadership structure, which is, of course, antithetical to communism. Because if you're a leader, you're going to end up having more power and more, you're going to have more control over others, which isn't right. So in that case, principle was sacrifice over victory, and look where the Soviet Union ended up. So the main strong point of religion is the fact that it doesn't really bend to victory. Its victory, it thinks, will be guaranteed as long as its principle stands strong. And that's what makes it so long lasting, because the principle doesn't change. You're still bound to the same issues. While that's of course changing now as the church tries to liberalize and to achieve more victory, that's been a trend over history and is what makes religion so successful. So now we're going to get into section 5, which is next steps for rebuilding the right. So there's a lot of ways this can go through, but first, some background on the general overview of how people get into the right, or the right-wing pipeline. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, you're not getting brainwashed, but how people join the right. And religion is a really big part of this, because the right promises all these religious fundamental ideas. You're going to be more compelled to join the right if you're a religious person to start with. So starting point A is compliance. So we talked about this in the last video, but compliance is when you first join a religion, or when you're young, or if you've been brought up in a religion all of your life, and you don't have any problems with it, and you still wholeheartedly believe in the religion. With all of your heart, you believe in the religion, so you're obviously going to lean to the right, at the very least, for social policy issues, right? For example, abortion. If that's a deeply emotional issue for you and you're a religious person, the right's the only way to go, if that's a high priority. So as we discussed in the last video, which of course I recommend you check out, compliance leads to rejection eventually in secular society. Excuse me? Why is that? Because as you start learning about science, the principles of science, as you start becoming more indoctrinated to the fundamentals of science, which is about principle, which is about process, right? Once you believe that you need evidence for everything, you start beginning to doubt your own religion. And we discussed in the last video that this isn't necessarily a different thing than religion, right? Religion believes that that God is there always, right? We don't need to question that, because that's the nature of religion. Science says we need to question everything to uncover the truth about the natural world. Now, these two aren't bad or good. They're just different. And what ends up happening is when you grow up in a fundamentally science-based society, as we are now, you end up going through rejection quite quickly. So that's starting point B. From rejection, you have a secular worldview. You don't feel a religious compulsion in a certain way, and therefore you have two ways you can go. Either the left, which promises you social morality, which isn't based on religion and is more free, unlike the restrictive yet useful, guidelines set by religion, or you end up going the practical route. For example, if you're a atheist economist and you happen to like conservative non-Keynesian economics, or you want small government, or any other Republican virtue or right-wing virtue that isn't religion-based, you go practical. That's a very easy way. So I guess starting point C, or even before A, would be practical. If you like the right's economic policies, you go right. Done. Problem solved. Alternatively, you could start at starting point B, depending on where you are. If you're, let's say, brought up atheist, and then of course you can go down the practical route, you can go down the left-wing route. So from the left, as we discussed in last, I guess 2 days ago's video, you might end up going back to compliance. So if you re-enter religion, if you re-enter and you re-grasp what you might have lost or what you never had, you're gonna end up going to the right, because for many people, if you wholeheartedly actually believe in a religion, you can't possibly go away from its virtues. So the problem we have right now with many people saying they're religious is that they're not actually religious. They don't have faith. They have science-based. They expect empirical evidence. For example, case in point, those people who say I'm religious but I need more proof for God, or I'm not religious because I don't have proof for God, or I was religious and I'm willing to be but I need proof for God, they're missing the point entirely. The point isn't that you need proof for God. The point is of religion that proof isn't even part of the equation. You shouldn't need to question it because that's the whole point. And to expect that you do need it means that you're not in tune with what religion actually expects from you. And that's the pipeline that many people go down, but ultimately it comes down to the point that you re-enter religion some point in your life and you end up going to the right. And that's what you see. Why are older people so socially right? So we have this reputation that all these boomers, they're not with the times, they're so sexist, all your ists and phobics, whatever. You have this idea, but if you go back in time, the boomer generation was extremely liberal for their time. They were the trailblazers of social liberalization. They saw, and it was in their lifetime, their work, that they saw the rise of the Civil Rights Act. Black people were finally equal in every other race. You saw the rise of free love. You wouldn't expect that. More people had sex in the 1960s and 70s out of wedlock than any other time in history, bar for war, maybe the Weimar Republic, whatever. Those times were a long. That time was extremely, extremely socially liberal, and it was constantly changing. Even maybe religion began to go down around that time as well. So that's what this sort of age thing is. Even if you join the left some point in your life, you're likely to reclaim religion as you mature, you become wise, and a greater amount of the population does get that back, and you end up entering the right. So why does this matter? I talked a lot about there. So why does this matter for the right? You need a way to get people from practical to the right and from the left to the right without going through compliance rejection or compliance. You need a way to get people into the right wing without them having to be 60-year-olds, wise men or women that re-enter religion. We can't have those people only joining, and we also can't only have people who grew up fundamentally Christian, Islamist, or Jewish or Hindu, whatever it may be. You cannot have your ideology only being populated by those who are religiously fundamental. So that this is where the how I mentioned principle versus victory comes in. Can you sacrifice your principle for victory? The answer here for the right is yes. You can do this. And how is that? And there's a sneaky way of doing this where you can just declare the right's values to be the right, the values of the religions or ideologies you've always served, but then in your messaging, in your promotions, in your media, you exclude the talk of religion. So you essentially become a secular version of the right, the religious right. And that's hard to hear, because principle does matter. And I think that it would be a huge loss for the religious community for this to happen. But for the right to win and actually, take charge of this rightward spiral and of this pendulum, yeah, it might be a necessary step. And it's difficult to say whether or not this will work, but it's definitely important to consider because so many people who aren't religious feel scared of the right because they don't understand that they feel like they'll be excluded, but it's not. It's that's a self-exclusion, and to convince people that that's not the case, you need to get rid of some of this religious dogma and maintain your principles while still getting rid of the religious messaging. So what this ultimately displays is how societies and ideologies develop. As you move out throughout time and social trends change, just like people not, declining religiosity, you need to align yourself with modernity. And modernity, it would be great if everyone could be religious. If we could have another great awakening where everyone reclaims spirituality and becomes more human themselves. But in the case that isn't happening, you can't keep holding on to this belief that, oh, everyone needs to find God, 'cause saying that isn't going to do anything. So instead, you bring them into your ideology. You teach them, or if they were willing at least, you make them believe in your morality. And once they have that, maybe they can be converted, but ultimately, you need to win. Principle versus victory. Victory needs to be prioritized for the right to currently take advantage of their position as the driving force in the pendulum's move to the right. So that was episode 5 of the Rhetoric Reviewed. This was a bit of a convoluted video. I skipped a day yesterday and I'm feeling a bit sick, a bit nasally. But yeah, if you have any comments, critiques, questions, or criticisms of anything I said here and you want to go into anything more, I'd be willing to discuss in the comment section down below. Otherwise, it's been the Rhetoric Reviewed.